So a year ago yesterday, my family and I started out on a journey that can only be described as life-changing. We packed up all of our things, we put them in storage. We were allowed to take 2 suitcases for each person, so that's a total of 12 suitcases. And we went to Finland for 11 months so that I could continue my seminary studies and also do some research on the Lutheran Church in Finland. And so today I'm going to share a little bit about that, and I also want to thank you for the support that you have shown our family. So it's probably helpful to give you a little bit of background, because most people don't know anything about Finland. It's a country of 5 million people in Northern Europe. So to give you some perspective, it's about not even half the size of the population of Pennsylvania, and the country is about the size of California. So there's a lot of land and very few people. About 1 million people live in the capital region in Helsinki, in the southern part of the country. So you can imagine the further north you go, the fewer people there are. Christianity has been in Finland for 1,000 years. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Our country is awfully young compared to that. What's important to understand about that is actually the role of the priest and the role of the church in the first bit of that history. Of course, the priest functioned, the country started off as Roman Catholic, and so the priest functioned as the representative of the state. The church was the state religion, and so, of course, when you needed something of a religious nature, you went to the priest. But of course, if the priest represents the government, then when you need a judgment against your neighbor for doing something wrong, you go to the priest, because they were the judge. And since they were the only ones who probably had any type of education in the town where they were also the doctor, along with other things as well. They served all functions. Times have changed. I think Pastor Dave and I would be very happy that they have from that time.
Yes.
But the important thing about this is that all municipal government, all forms of government in Finland come from the church. So for the first 500 years, Finland was Catholic, and then the king, during the time of Reformation, they were under the Swedish crown, decided that they would become Lutheran, and the next day they were Lutheran, and everyone said, okay, and they became Lutheran. And they've been Lutheran ever since. Very, very interesting, very different. While I was there, I took some time and I did some studies at the University of Helsinki. And the university is very different than the seminary. For one thing, it provides you a very unique Finnish perspective on Lutheran theology, something that you can't get anywhere else. There's also a very diverse student body, and I mean that in terms of the met people from all over the world, literally, who speak multiple different languages and come from very different religious backgrounds, including no religious belief at all. It was the first time that I had met someone who was an atheist who was studying theology, which I still don't understand why you would study theology as an atheist, but they were doing that. But it became a little bit clearer as I went a little bit on. But a big difference between the university and the seminary is that the university does not start with a foundation of faith, as the seminary does. Seminary is there partially to help form pastors for ministry. The university is not doing that. That's part of their job is to train students for a Master of Divinity, but it doesn't start with a faith foundation. So when students graduate and they feel like they want to go into ministry as a Lutheran pastor, they only need a Master of Divinity. The church is not involved in this process, and so there are people who graduate with no faith, and then they go and they look for a job just like anyone else as a pastor, and they can get those jobs, and it creates some challenges for the church. But not all pastors are like that, so that's good news. During my time there, I also spent time researching the Lutheran Church, talking with anyone and everyone who was willing to talk about the church and society, the challenges that it faced, the membership decline, who cared about it, what were they doing, what was working, all those type of things, attending different types of services. The church sent me on a couple of different trips, reading a lot of material, you name it. And what I found was that the current situation of the church is that it's still very dominant, but it has a declining membership. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Lutheran Church in Finland was the official state church for most of the history, along with one other church, the Finnish Orthodox Church, which is primarily in the eastern part of the country. And to give you a little perspective, the Finnish Orthodox Church is the second largest denomination in Finland, and it represents 1% of the population. It's about 60,000 people. The other denominations in the country, just think of any Christian denomination, lump them all together, they equal about 1% of the population combined. So to give you a little perspective on this, if you wanted to go and find someone who is Catholic in Finland, you'd have to struggle. There are a total of about 6,500 Catholics in the country. Everything comes from a Lutheran standpoint in the country. Ecumenical dialogue starts from a Lutheran perspective. Other churches, their services look very Lutheran because everything starts from a Lutheran perspective in Finland. If you wanted to go to Lutheran heaven, you'd go to Finland. So there's this decline in membership. It used to be high 90% because at one point it was a law that you had to be a member of the church. And you had to go to communion, otherwise you would pay a fine. And of course times have changed, that there's freedom of religion, people do not have to be a part of the church anymore. And so they've started to leave the church for various different reasons. Currently in the country, the membership is around 70%. And in Helsinki, the capital, it's about 50%. There's been a lot of different reasons for all these changes. I don't have enough time to go into that today, but if you come next Wednesday, you'll hear more about that. And so typically what happens is that the typical Finn will have 3 interactions with the church: baptism, wedding, and funeral. And that's how most Finns have any type of interaction with the church. During a lot of the discussions that I had with people, I asked them about the role of the church in society and the challenges that the church faces. And I observed and heard really that there's 3 challenges that the church faces. And every time that I heard these, I expressed these to the people I was talking with, and they always had the same response: yep, that's accurate, which is kind of shocking. But the 3 challenges that the church faces in Finland are being relevant, being approachable, and being enjoyable. And I think I can kind of sum that up into an experience I had at one service. I went to there's an Easter Vigil service, of course, the night before Easter. It's my favorite service of the year, so I thought, well, this will be a great experience to see what a Finnish Lutheran Easter Vigil is like. Of course, it was in Finnish, and my Finnish is not that great, but you can follow along. It's a Lutheran service, so it's pretty similar. And everything was going fine, but something didn't feel right. And it didn't strike me until we got to the sermon. And so the pastor gave a sermon, and afterwards I asked a friend who was participating in the service, what did the pastor say? Because I'm very curious about what the pastor had said. I picked up a few things here and there, and I had an idea, but I wanted to know what was being said. And this friend of mine, who's also a pastor, had told me in the tone of voice that the pastor who gave the sermon, she said, here was the sermon: Christ has died for our sins. He is risen from the dead. We can rejoice. So that's when I recognized, oh, there's a problem here. When you give a message that's the best news in the history of creation, like that, how can a church be relevant? How can God be approachable? And certainly, that's not very enjoyable to sit through that. You can see this in other ways. By law, there's a requirement that there has to be a Lutheran service in every Lutheran church at 10 a.m. on Sunday. And there's not much room for change with that, because it's set in law. And so those services at 10 a.m. on Sunday are not very thriving. There's not many people there, and that's a shame. But the good news is there are other pastors who know and they can see what's going on. They can see that things have to change a little bit. And so they've started doing some different types of services that speak to different audiences, not in competition with the 10 a.m. service, but are trying to reach out to people who the 10 a.m. service doesn't speak to. So they're offering services at different times and different days. They're engaging people. Those services are well attended. They're doing unique things. The people who come are no longer spectators, but are participating. These pastors are doing things that are causing them to think outside of the box. I'll finish up with a story of a discussion I had with the Bishop of Helsinki, who's the first female bishop in Finland. And that's really a big deal, and it creates a lot of controversy and everything. That's another story in and of itself. But a wonderful conversation with her, and I told her about the things that I was observing, about the challenges that the church faces, and the different services I had gone to, and all these type of things. And I had asked her, does everybody I talk to, they recognize these challenges, so why do these challenges still exist? This is not a shock to anybody. I'm not revealing anything new. And what she told me was very interesting. She said that change is happening in the church. It's just not coming from the top down. It can't, because it's too bureaucratic. But change is happening at the bottom. God is at work in the church in Finland, in spite of the bureaucracy of itself. And then she related back to me the things that I had experienced, the different church services. These were not mandated by anybody, but they were a pastor and a group of people saw that there was a need, and so they started to do something at a very local level. And you could see it in other areas of the church as well, where people were doing pastoral care very differently than what had been done previously. And there are plenty of other examples. So the church is at work. God is at work in the church in Finland. And God is at work in the church in the United States. And sometimes we lose perspective. We're trying to look at, always focused on the big picture of seeing the numbers, and the decline, and all the statistics and everything. And sometimes we forget about the details and the small things that go on, because sometimes God works in the small things. Actually, God works in the small things a lot. And so it's very interesting. Finland, in some ways, is very similar to the United States and the challenges that we face, but also very unique because of its culture, its language, its history. And yet, there's so many things that we can do together, and we can learn from each other, not try to say, hey, this works here, so let's do it over there, or vice versa. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to have gone over to Finland, to make friendships, to learn about the church, and seeing how God is at work at the church in Finland, and seeing with fresh eyes, new perspective on how God is at work here in the United States. I thank you for your support, and I look forward to sharing more next Wednesday.